Hello and welcome to Science on the Edge. I'm Dr. Mark Darcy, and in this episode I will be discussing consciousness. This is more of a philosophical topic than you would usually expect from me. There will be some biology, there will be some science, but there will also be quite a bit of philosophy. The reason for this is that consciousness is simply not a very well understood subject. And not being very well understood, a number of very spiritual concepts have been used to try to explain it. I'm going to try and steer as far away from the purely spiritual as I can, and to embed a lot of the information that I discuss in the underlying science, but there will nonetheless be quite a bit of philosophy mixed in with the science in this podcast. It's kind of unavoidable in such a poorly understood subject as consciousness. Okay, so let's get started. So, how would you define consciousness? Well, there have been a number of attempts to define consciousness. I'm going to give you a couple of them. First of all, consciousness is a state of awareness and responsiveness. So, an awareness and a responsiveness to what? Well, to events in the environment around us, and also to our own mental processes, known as inner awareness. So we can be conscious of both ourselves and the environment around us. Example, your knowledge of your feelings, thoughts, and your memories. So consciousness versus mind, what's the difference between consciousness and mind? These two concepts are quite often confused with each other. Consciousness is not mind. Mind is not consciousness in a very clear sense of those two terms, despite a lot of people kind of conflating those two ideas. Mind is more of a psychological notion used in cognitive psychology or in neuroscience. It refers to a process of thinking, processes which are running in the brain. Consciousness, however, is more of a phenomenological notion. It presupposes a specific mental reality which presumably differs from physical reality. Mental reality definitely does differ from the physical reality around us. There are so many aspects of reality that we are unaware of. For example, we can see in the visible spectrum. We can't, however, see in infrared or ultraviolet. Some animals can, humans can't. So we perceive reality internally is very different from how reality is externally. There's a lot going on that we simply are not aware of. We're not conscious of. Okay, now, when it comes to consciousness, there's really two ways of looking at consciousness. There are two problems to try and analyze. There is the easy problem and there is a hard problem. Although some researchers in consciousness say that the hard problem is also an easy problem. Okay, so let's define easy problem and hard problem. Good definitions are provided by David Chalmers, a philosopher. So first, the easy problem. David states, how could a physical system be the sort of thing that could learn or that could remember? That's the easy problem. Doesn't sound so easy, but we have made a lot of progress in understanding this particular problem. For example, we know to quite a large degree how the visual cortex of our brain allows us to perceive colours, shapes, movement, depth, all of those things. So basically, we know what sequences of neurons need to be connected in which particular part of the brain to allow us to perceive sight. The same could be said for hearing, taste, touch, smell, etc. Basically, we know which regions of our brains are involved in those particular processes. We know what connections need to be present in the brain. And we also know that if you disrupt those connections through an injury or a tumor or by some sort of surgery, the ability to perceive certain sensations will be removed. A human can lose all awareness of one side of their vision, the left field of vision or the right field of vision, if part of their brain becomes damaged. So, and I don't mean they just don't see it, I mean they are completely unaware of it. It could be that they can look around, they could draw a house, for example, that they see in front of them, and they will draw only half of that house. Despite being able to see the whole house, they can move their eyes around, but they still only draw half of the house if particular regions of their brain are damaged. So they lose all awareness of one entire field of their vision. They lose conscious awareness. So we know which structures of the brain are involved in sensation, in perception, and we're learning more and more about these particular structures in the brain, how to map them, how to put them together, all of the rest. This is the easy problem. We're making real progress, long way to go, but we are making progress. And then there is the hard problem. Now the hard problem, as David Chalmers defines it, goes as follows. How could a physical system be the sort of thing that could experience pain or vision or hearing or anything else? It's one thing to say that a particular configuration of neurons in a particular section of the brain allows us to feel pain, but why is there an actual sensation? Why is it like something to be something? You can conceive of a human being kind of like a zombie, a biological machine that can react to external stimuli using particular pre-programmed behaviors. So someone throws a ball at the human reaches out the hand and catches the ball, all because certain parts of the brain have sensed the movement of the ball, and then parts of the motor cortex of the brain have then controlled muscles in the arm to reach out and catch the ball. So we can understand how particular parts of the brain can come together to allow a human to react to stimuli, react to things that a person says to them. So someone could speak to you and you could react with all the correct responses, but without being consciously aware at all. To react to something just involves certain parts of the brain processing information and responding to that information. But why is that like something? Why does it feel like something to hear a sound, to see something, or to feel pain? That's the hard problem. The term that's generally used by philosophers to define sensations, the perception of sensations, is the term qualia. Qualia stands for qualitative experience. So basically, qualia are perceptions, not just the firing of neurons in the brain, but the feeling associated with a particular sensation. So the color red is a qualia. The sensation of pain is a qualia. Sound is a qualia. All these things are qualia. They are perceptions of experience, and that's the hard problem. And to be absolutely honest, we have not really made much progress in determining the answer to the hard problem. Why is it like something to be something? The reaction of some philosophers when confronted with the hard problem is to pretend it doesn't exist, to say it's not a problem at all. For example, the philosopher Daniel Dennett, he takes this approach. He says that no, it's all easy problem. There is no hard problem. It's all easy problem. It's all just about parallel processing in different parts of the brain, neurons firing. When it all comes together, we have awareness. No hard problem. It's just a series of easy problems that we haven't yet worked out yet. And when we finally do work out all of these easy problems, the hard problem by definition will have been solved. I don't know. That doesn't make sense to me. I'm not a philosopher. I'm a biologist, specifically a cell and molecular biologist, but I have read a little bit about this topic and it just doesn't gel. I can't see any way that just learning about all the different connections in the brain will lead to the answer to why is it like something to be something. All we will have learned is that when a particular set of neurons fire in a particular way, we become aware, we become conscious. but that doesn't answer why we are conscious, why it's like something to be something. Now, David Chalmers and a few other philosophers, they've come up with their own ideas of why it's like something to be something. I'm not sure I buy their ideas either. David Chalmers, he basically says that consciousness is kind of like, it's like gravity. It's like electromagnetism. It's a simple primitive of the universe. It's a force, almost. We don't have an explanation for why electromagnetism exists or for why gravity exists. I mean, we have theories, but it all boils down to certain forces are just primitive. They are just core parts of the universe. All particles experience these forces. And David says it's the same with consciousness. Consciousness is just an inherent component of the universe. Different things have a different level of consciousness. To David, basically, an atom, even an electron, has a tiny, tiny bit of consciousness. It's not aware in anywhere near the same way we are, but there's a tiny bit of this sort of primitive beginning block of consciousness. And in higher organisms, it all comes together to make individuals consciously aware. I don't know, that sounds a bit like religion to me. It sounds like, the religion it sounds like to me is the Force from the Star Wars movies. The universe just has a consciousness, has an awareness, just like the Force. No, I don't buy it. Maybe true, but I think it's another kind of cop-out. David Chalmers has done well in identifying that there is a hard problem, but I'm not sure about his explanation for it. Other people have come up with ideas and solutions, possible solutions, to try and explain that hard problem as well. For example, Francis Crick. Francis Crick, who you may have heard of, together with James Watson and Rosalind Franklin, they worked out the structure of DNA. And Francis Crick and James Watson actually got a Nobel Prize for that. I believe Rosalind Franklin should have got a Nobel Prize too, but that's a whole other story. It was a different age, there was a lot more sexism around, etc., etc. Anyway, moving on. Francis Crick did discover a structure of DNA, but he also worked in other fields as well. He was a very, very clever guy. And for a sizable chunk of his life, he worked in the field of consciousness. He tried to work out what consciousness is. And he came up with a solution. Again, it's another kind of vague solution. His solution basically revolved around the fact that different bits of the brain, when they don't fire in unison, when they fire kind of out of sync at different frequencies, you are not consciously aware. So, for example, when you're unconscious, if you've taken a local anesthetic, or if you're in a dreamless sleep, different parts of the brain are not firing in synchronicity with each other. And as a result, you are not conscious. However, when a number of regions throughout the brain start to fire in sync at the same sort of frequency, then you become consciousness. There's a certain frequency at which the neurons start to fire throughout the brain that makes you consciously aware. He'd got some evidence for this. He had measured brains, and he could see that when you are consciousness, that is true. The brain starts to fire in a certain kind of synchronicity. But again, that doesn't explain the hard problem. It's just a more easy problem. It explains what's going on in the brain when you're conscious, but it doesn't say why that feels like something, why there is any qualia associated with it. So it was a good attempt again, and possibly it's another piece of the puzzle, but it wasn't an answer. It wasn't an answer to the hard problem. Okay, so let's talk about the field itself briefly. The field of studying consciousness is known broadly as the philosophy of mind. The philosophy of mind covers two main areas. One, what is mind? And two, how is it connected with matter, namely a brain? That's the philosophy of mind. And all the different areas of consciousness kind of fall into that overwhelming topic. Okay, so do we have any answers? Well, generally speaking, there's two possible answers to these questions. One, we can assert that the mind is something material, therefore the mind is just a part of the body, Or it's possible to state that the mind is not a material or physical thing, in which case it's somehow connected with a body but not reduced to it. And that doesn't necessarily mean a soul. We're not talking necessarily about the concept of a soul. The mind could be something entirely separate from any kind of religious links. But that's a possibility too. So basically, the mind is either a physical thing or it's something entirely separate that's connected to a physical thing. In fact, the first real theory of mind went along those lines. Cognito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. You've all heard that term before. It was Descartes who came up with it. Basically, it was a way of trying to explain the universe, explain yourself, that you are real. I mean, we are all aware of various sensations, various inputs coming into our brain. We see things, we hear things, we touch things, all of the rest. However, that could all be an illusion. For all you know, you're a brain in a vat, and sensations are just being pumped into that brain. There may be no external world around you. But one thing you can be sure about, you can be sure, even if everything around you is just a dream, you can be aware and you can be certain that you exist. You can't be sure that anything around you exists. It could be a dream, but nonetheless, you know you exist because to be able to ask the question, do I exist, immediately tells you do exist, because only someone that does exist can even ask that question, can even feel that urge. So that proves that you exist. We have proof that we exist. That's all we have proof of, really. I don't know you exist. You don't know anyone around you exists. You don't know the universe exists. The chair that you're sitting on exists. The floor that you're walking on exists. But you know you exist. You know that there is a mind and it's you. Okay, this led Descartes to come up with the idea of dualism. There is a mind and there is a body. There is a physical body and there is a mental realm, the mind. These two are not the same thing according to dualism. They are separate. They interact with each other, but they're separate. There's a number of kind of ideas which are linked to this to try and prove that there are two different types of thing, that the physical and the mental are entirely separate. They inhabit different realms. For example, everything in the physical world has dimensions. It has height, it has width, it has depth. Table has height, width, and depth. So does a carpet, so does a cloud, so does a tree, so does another human. Everything has physical dimensions. Everything in the matter universe, the physical universe. Other mental things don't have dimensions. What is the length of the colour red? What is the height of love? What is the depth of fear? He builds on this, Descartes. It's not just that mental things don't have dimensions. There's other properties that they're like, other physical properties. All physical objects have got, for example, weight, texture. Mental things don't. Love has no weight. Neither does fear. Neither does the colour blue. So, this idea is that physical things have physical properties, mental things have mental properties, and therefore they must exist in separate universes. This is dualism. There is the mind, and there is the body. But then this leads to certain issues. One obvious issue is if the physical and the mental are separate things in separate universes, then they shouldn't be able to interact with each other. And they plainly do. If I drink alcohol, my behavior will change, my thoughts will change, my perceptions will change. So a physical thing, alcohol, is interacting with my mental realm. Now, the way you think can also interact with the physical realm. If I get nervous, if I get anxious, my heart rate will speed up. Maybe I will start shaking, maybe I will go pale. The mental realm is therefore influencing the physical realm. So there has to be a link between the two. And what is that link if these are separate universes? Well, Descartes had an answer to that question as well. Descartes was actually doing quite well until this point. His ideas are very strong, but then he kind of went off-piste a little bit. Descartes' idea of how the physical and the mental came together was to take a structure within the brain, the pineal gland. The pineal gland is a small structure involved in controlling the circadian rhythm in our brains. Very small structure. And he said that that is where the physical and the mental came together, that one little structure in the human brain. He also used this as an explanation for the fact that he didn't believe that animals had a mind, that they were just physical. He basically said animals don't have a pineal gland, therefore there is nowhere for the physical and the mental to interact, in which case they must just be physical, like an automata, like a robot, no mental realm. Well, there's lots of holes we can put in this argument. The first one is the fact that animals have a pineal gland. Many animals, mammals, have a pineal gland. Other animals, such as birds, also have a pineal gland. So the pineal gland is not exclusive to humans. I think this was just Descartes' prejudices showing. He believed humans to be superior to animals. So this was a way of kind of solidifying that idea in his mind. And again, it doesn't really answer a question. I mean, the pineal gland is still a physical entity. How does the mental realm interact with that physical entity? So dualism. Dualism doesn't kind of work in that pure form. However, it's what most people still kind of think intuitively. If you to ask the average person about mind and body, they would say, yes, they are separate things. There is the mind and there is the body. It feels like they're separate things. We all kind of feel like we're some kind of homunculus, some virtual entity sitting in our head, behind our eyes, looking out, operating the machinery of our body. We feel like we're a mental thing operating a physical thing. So dualism is quite intuitive. It's natural to think in those terms. But just because something is natural does not mean it is correct. Humans make lots of mistakes. For a great proportion of our existence, we believe the earth to be flat because it feels flat, it looks flat. But we were wrong. We were totally wrong. Okay, so that's dualism. I'll come back to dualism later. The kind of alternative to dualism is physicalism, the idea that everything is really just physical, that it is all just machinery. But there's other ideas. Some kind of relate to dualism, some are entirely separate. So the next idea that I'm going to discuss is the idea that consciousness is kind of an emergent phenomenon. What does emergent mean? Emergent is when a quality arises through lots of components, physical components interacting with each other. For example, liquid water. There is no real physical thing known as liquid water. Not really, not when you drill down. When you drill down, you have molecules of H2O, individual molecules of water, 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen. If I was to take an H2O molecule, it would not be behaving in any way like liquid water. However, if I put a great number of these H2O molecules together, and I have the right conditions, the right temperature, the right pressure, then an emergent phenomena will appear, that of liquid water. You will have something that behaves as we expect liquid water to behave. So liquid water is an emergent phenomenon. It arises when you put enough H2O molecules together in the right conditions. And perhaps the human mind is like that. There is the brain. The brain is a bunch of neurons, all connected in certain ways. Individually, there is no consciousness. There is no mind. But if you bring all these neurons together in the right patterns, in the right conditions, you get consciousness, an emergent phenomenon. Okay, there's a certain sense that this makes. It does make a certain sense. You can bring H2O molecules together in the right conditions, you get water. You can even bring water together under the right conditions, and you get another emergent phenomenon, that of waves on the water. So why not consciousness? Why could that not be the same? This has a certain logic to it. I like the idea of it. But again, it's just an idea without proof. Everything is just an idea until we get proof to actually prove that idea. We need something to back it up. Just because something sounds good does not mean it's correct. But that's one idea. Emergent phenomenon. Could even be an accidental emergent phenomenon. What do I mean by accidental? Well, we assume that the purpose of the brain is to be conscious. Well, the brain evolved like every other structure in our body. Its purpose is to carry our genes around and to allow them to survive long enough to be passed on to the next generation so that we can find a mate and the genes can be copied. Evolution by natural selection, survival of the fittest. Our brains have evolved to allow our genes to be passed on most efficiently to the next generation. Perhaps a byproduct of that is consciousness. Perhaps it's not actually the purpose. It could be that consciousness is necessary. It actually helps us to become more efficient and to pass on our genes more effectively to the next generation. So it could be an evolutionary beneficial trait, consciousness. However, it could just be a byproduct. When you look at a steam engine going along a track, the steam engine makes a noise and steam pumps out of the top of that train. But producing steam isn't the purpose of that train. Moving is the purpose of that train. The steam coming out of the top is merely a byproduct. It's what you get when you make a steam engine. You get steam. Steam is released from the train. And maybe it's like that with consciousness. Maybe consciousness is just a byproduct of making a human brain. It's a steam rising from the engine. Maybe there's no good use for it. It's just a byproduct. Interesting idea. I like it, but I don't buy it. Don't buy it for a couple of reasons. First of all, to do anything, including thinking, requires energy. You need to use energy to think. You need energy to be aware. And evolution tries to be as efficient as possible. It tries to use its energy to grow and to find a mate and to reproduce. So wasting that energy on making something conscious, unless consciousness was beneficial in some way, probably wouldn't happen. Evolution would not have produced consciousness, something that uses energy, unless consciousness had some sort of benefit. So I don't buy that one either, but it's an interesting idea and it may be true. May be true. Okay, so moving on. Is my experience the same as yours? When you see red, is it the same red that I see? When I feel a sensation, do you feel that sensation the same way that I do? Well, we can never be sure, not totally sure. For all we know, my red is your blue is my red. We are taught that a particular crayon is red in color or blue in color. So we associate that word blue or red with what we see when we look at that crayon or that car or that other object. But that doesn't tell me how you experience that color. It doesn't tell you how I experience that color. I may see red, and your experience of that red may be my experience of blue and vice versa. There's actually been a few attempts to determine if this is actually true. And I may go through some of those methods, those philosophical stories, let's say, later in this podcast. But here I'm just going to leave it hanging, that concept. We all experience something, but that something is very personal to us, and we can never know for sure that another individual has the same experience. I mean, this is obvious with some things. For example, a particular environment may stimulate fear in one individual, yet excitement in another individual. Now, fear and excitement are actually pretty much the same thing physiologically. You get an adrenaline rush, your heart races, you become hyper alert, but one person will associate all those sensations with pleasure. It's exciting. whereas another will associate all those impulses with fear. It's very personal experience. Okay, well, I'll leave that hanging there for now, and I'm going to move on to something else, to another interesting topic. Now, this is more to do with individuality than consciousness, but it all relates. Are we the same person over time? Now, you've probably all heard at some point on the TV, in a book, whatever, that over time our bodies regenerate. The you from 10 years ago is a different physical you than the you of today. Your cells have regenerated, molecules have been replaced, you breathe air, you drink water, you eat food, cells wear out and they're replaced with new material. Throughout your life, your body entirely regenerates several times, yet you feel a continuity. You feel like you're the same person that you were as a child, that you were as a younger adult. You have the memories of that child, and therefore you feel like you are that child. Still, it's just later on in the day. But are we? Imagine if consciousness is a momentary thing. Conscious awareness exists fleetingly. You are conscious right now, this second, and therefore you are alive, you exist for that second. But maybe when you lose consciousness, or when you get distracted, that you ceases to be. And another you comes into existence the next time you're consciously aware. That new you has all the memories of the old you. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the same person though. Perhaps every morning when you wake up, you're a new individual after losing consciousness during the night. A new person is born with all the memories of the old individual, but the old individual is dead, is gone, ceases to exist. It just feels continuous. We have no way of knowing this, but it's possible. It's possible. Now, a good analogy for this is an ancient Greek philosophical story, the ship of Theseus. So the ship of Theseus, an ancient Athenian hero. He was a very renowned hero, won lots of battles, and the Athenians, out of respect for him, they preserved his ship, the ship of Theseus. They preserved it in the harbour as a relic to him. Now, over the years, over the decades, over the centuries, that ship obviously started to wear away. Panels needed to be replaced. Sails needed to be changed. Bolts and screws were replaced. So over time, the ship was repaired. Now, after a certain amount of time, let's say a century, every part of that ship had been changed. Every single panel, every single board, every single sail. Was it still the ship of Theseus? Or was the ship of Theseus the old ship, the original ship with all the original panels and rigging? And if it no longer is the old ship of Theseus, then when did it cease to be the ship of Theseus? Was it when the first panel was replaced? Was it when more than 50% of the ship had been replaced? Or was it at the very end when the last panel, the last piece of rigging had been replaced? When did it cease to be the ship of Theseus? It's the same with your body. Your body has gradually been replaced over time. All the matter within it has been replaced as your body wore out. Are you the same person? Or are you a completely different person than you were 10 years ago, 15 years ago? And if you are a different person, when did you become a different person? I have no answer to those questions. It's more of a thought experiment to make you kind of think about how difficult this idea of individuality and consciousness really is. We don't know what it is to be an individual, a single unity. And as a result of that, it's very hard to pinpoint consciousness. We lose consciousness every night, it goes away. We don't know when the person wakes up the next day if that is the same individual or if it's a new individual with the same old memories. Okay, so we'll leave that floating around in your brain and let's move on again. I'm going to, by the way, I know this first section of a podcast seems very, very philosophical, and it's going to continue in that vein for a little while longer. I just want to get the big ideas into your mind before I start going to the nitty-gritty of how the brain works. and how we physically are trying to understand consciousness. So with that in mind, I'm now going to introduce another interesting philosophical idea, that of the Boltzmann brain. What is a Boltzmann brain? Well, before I explain what the Boltzmann brain itself is, I need to explain a couple of things about the universe. The universe has not existed for very long. Well, it's actually existed, as far as we're aware, since the Big Bang. This part of the universe has existed for about 13.9 billion years. Seems like a long time, but physicists have extrapolated the universe's future from where we are now. And if the laws of physics stay the same, the universe will exist for a long, long time, a very long time. So 13.9 billion years might seem like a long time, but we're talking about an almost infinite future for our universe. For example, I'll give you a couple of numbers. A Google is 1 with 100 zeros after it. The universe will still be around in a Google of years. A Googleplex is 1 with a Google of zeros after it. The universe will still be around then as well. So the universe is really just at the very beginning of its history. However, it's at an interesting point nonetheless. This part of the universe's existence is the part where we have stars and where we have planets and where biology is possible. For most of the universe's future, that won't be true. The universe is expanding at a faster rate. At the moment, that expansion is not powerful enough to prevent gravity from forming planets and stars, and therefore life. However, for most of the universe's future, the expansion will be just too much for that to occur. All the particles will be too far apart. Gravity will be overwhelmed. Eventually, the universe will tear itself apart. But the point is, for most of the universe's future, there will not be planets, there will not be stars. However, there may still be minds. There may still be brains. How is this so? Well, the reason for this is basically the uncertainty principle. If you have enough time, everything will happen. Think about taking a handful of sand. If you throw that handful of sand on the ground, it will create just a random pattern of sand on the ground. If you throw it again, another random pattern of sand. Again. If you throw it enough times, however, just randomly, at some point you will throw it and you will get a perfectly formed sandcastle. Perfect. It will take a lot of throws to get that, but it will eventually happen. If you've got an almost infinite amount of time, every configuration of those sand particles will be realized. In fact, it won't just be realized once, it will be realized almost an infinite number of times. You'll get an infinite number of sandcastles. And it's the same with the universe. The universe is huge, and though we're talking about a huge amount of time in the future. What does this mean for life? Well, it means that sooner or later, random particles are going to come together in this future universe. There's going to be quantum fluctuations which bring things into existence, and most of those things will have no real pattern or symmetry to them. But in an infinite amount of time, sooner or later, a perfect replica of you will emerge. A perfect brain will emerge. And for a brief moment, or a few moments, it will be conscious. That brain that emerges could be you. Could have every memory that you have, every experience that you have. Perhaps that's what you are right now. You've come into existence. You didn't exist 2 seconds ago. And now you exist. There's been a random fluctuation in the far future. A bunch of molecules have come together and they have made your mind with your memories and your experiences, and you think you're you. You're in for a disappointment shortly as that brain comes apart and dissipates. But for the briefest of moments, you will be absolutely convinced that you are you. This is what a Boltzmann brain is. These brains, these minds, these structures that just come spontaneously into existence in the infinite expanse of time. So what? Well, I'm not talking about one brain emerging. I'm not talking about two brains emerging. I'm talking about, in an infinite universe with almost an infinite expanse of time, an almost infinite amount, an infinite number of these brains coming into existence. So I'm not saying you come into existence once or twice. I'm saying you come into an existence an almost infinite number of times. So, if you do the maths, and the universe does continue for an infinite amount of time, it's more likely that someone, an entity, experiencing what you are experiencing right now with your memories, is more likely to be a Boltzmann brain than a real human. Because as I said at the beginning, the time, the part of the history of the universe where planets and stars are possible is minute compared with the infinite expanse of time. So doing the maths, there's not going to be many physical yous at the beginning of the universe, but there's going to be almost an infinite number of the generated Boltzmann brain versions of you throughout the future of the universe. So, more likely to be one of those than a physical human being. Okay, that's one more philosophical conundrum to wrap your mind around. I'm going to give you another, a final one. And then we'll start getting to the nitty-gritty of how the brain works. What I'm going to discuss now is something known as the simulation hypothesis. The simulation hypothesis was put forward by Nick Bostrom in 2003. I'll give you a sort of summary of it first, and then I'll discuss it for a couple of minutes. So, there's 3 points, 1, 2, and 3. 1. The fraction of human-level civilizations that reach a post-human stage, that is one capable of running high-fidelity ancestor simulations, is very close to 0. Or 2, the fraction of post-human civilizations that are interested in running simulations of their evolutionary history or variations thereof is very close to 0. Or 3, the fraction of all people with our kind of experiences that are living in a simulation is very close to 1. You may be confused. What did I mean by that? Okay, the first point. The fraction of human-level civilizations that reach a post-human stage, that is one capable of running high-fidelity ancestor simulation, is very close to 0. This basically means that are we, in the future, going to develop the technology that allows us to simulate human minds on computers? Is that going to happen? Now, the rate that IT and AI is developing is very, very fast. In just a few decades, we've gone from computers the size of buildings that were less powerful than a digital wristwatch to computers that can produce VR and all sorts of other things. We've done that in a few decades. The technology is improving. So in the future, it may be possible for us to simulate human minds on a computer in a virtual environment so that they don't even know they're computer generated. They will feel like a real human being in a real world. The technology may be available eventually, I'm not saying soon, could be centuries away, but it may be possible to do that in the future. And if it's possible to do it once, it's possible to do it in an almost infinite number of times. So we could, for example, create whole planets, millions, billions, trillions of human minds or human-like minds in virtual environments. Now, doing that, once the technology is possible and quick enough, you can understand that it might rapidly become possible to create so many of these minds for all sorts of purposes, maybe just to simulate alternative histories or for other scientific reasons. What would happen if we changed this variable or that variable in a society? What would that do to future societies? How would that affect future societies? That's one possibility. So there's all sorts of reasons we might want to make these simulations these simulations of societies or ancestor simulations. And if we can do it, then we could, in theory, do it an infinite number of times. And if you extrapolate throughout the future, over the millions and millions of years as we progress, there could be an almost infinite number of these simulations generated, far outnumbering the number of real human beings that exist in the real universe. And it might be that none of these simulations even realize this. That's one possibility. Now, we don't know how likely it is that we're going to achieve this. Now, let's say it's not very likely, that there's some problem with the technology and it's just not possible to simulate a mind. Okay, that leads us to 2. The fraction of post-human civilizations that are interested in running simulations of the evolutionary history or variations thereof is very close to 0. So it might be that we simply don't want to do it, that future descendants of us just have no interest in creating simulations. Maybe there are laws to prevent them, or maybe they just move beyond that point. They evolve to a state where they are just not interested in creating simulated worlds. That's possible. That's possible. Leading to 3, perhaps a fraction of all people with our kind of experiences that are living in a simulation is very close to 1. This means that perhaps, if we do develop the technology to create simulations, and we do decide to use that technology, then in all likelihood, we are all simulations. The logic is quite straightforward. If we develop the technology and the technology exists for long enough and we choose to use it, then we will, by definition, create countless simulations with countless trillions of inhabitants. So the likelihood of you being one of the true original human beings in the real universe would be very small. So perhaps your consciousness does not exist in a physical body. Perhaps Descartes was right in his his idea that perhaps you are being fooled. You cannot trust your senses. You can still trust one aspect of your universe, though, and that is that you have a universe, you are conscious. You exist in a universe of some sort, simulated or otherwise, and you are a conscious entity. I think, therefore I am. Cognito, ergo sum. Okay, well that's most of the philosophy out of the way. I'm guessing your brains are feeling suitably blown right now. It's time that we actually got to the nitty-gritty of how our brains perceive consciousness. Now, before I go into the exact details of that, I just want to kind of outline a few little concepts. First of all, are animals conscious? Well, we are conscious, and we share many genes and many physiological traits with other animals. So, in all likelihood, at least closely related species to humans are conscious, and perhaps less closely related species. There's a lot of evidence showing that primates are conscious. They seem to behave and respond as we do. Many mammals, many birds, things like crows, for example, ravens, exhibit very complex behavior. Even very distantly related species like the octopus and the cuttlefish. These organisms, we share a common ancestor with them, but it was several 100 million years ago. Yet, these animals show very complex behavior. They seem to exhibit emotions. The emotions are written on their bodies in bright colors. They seem exceptionally intelligent, the octopus and the cuttlefish, the squid-related species. So perhaps they have consciousness too. If they do, their consciousness works in a very different way than ours does. Their brains are not very similar to ours. Different structures. Yet, they seem to exhibit similar behaviors in many ways. Could machines become conscious? This relates very strongly to the previous discussion about the simulation hypotheses. We don't know whether machines can become conscious. We really don't know. The problem is we don't know what makes us conscious, not really. So we don't know if that can be replicated in a machine. Depends. If consciousness is really just an epiphenomenon, if it is something that arises when particular patterns of information are organized, then maybe the substrate doesn't matter. Maybe it doesn't matter whether the physical structures, the matter, is biological or mechanical, electronic, silicon, whatever. Maybe consciousness is substrate independent, in which case perhaps a machine can become conscious. People are working to develop conscious machines as we speak. A number of philosophers, again with the philosophers, have debated whether it's possible for a machine to become conscious. I don't want to get into too many details about this, but minds, such as human brains, work a little bit differently than most computer systems. Most of the computer systems that we use today perform something called symbol manipulation. Symbols go in, calculations are performed with the symbols, other symbols go out. That's how computer programs work. Human brains don't really work in that way. We're not about symbol manipulation. It's not about algorithms. Brains don't quite work like that, physical brains. And perhaps symbol manipulation isn't enough. You can't get a mind with pure symbol manipulation. But that just means that modern computer systems couldn't become conscious. But people are developing other types of computer systems that don't rely on symbol manipulation, and maybe they could become conscious. I'll give you a little analogy for this. So imagine there's a room. This philosophical thought experiment is known as a Chinese room. So there's an individual in a room. He doesn't speak Chinese, but Chinese words are slid under the door of the room to him. And he has a database in that room. So perhaps he has big filing cabinets. He knows when this symbol comes in, or this series of symbols come in through the door, to output other symbols from his database, other Chinese characters. Certain Chinese symbols come in through the door, and he has rules which tell him that when those symbols come in, he is to gather corresponding symbols, a certain sequence of response symbols, and slide them back under the door. So basically, he can answer questions in Chinese. Someone asks him a question in Chinese, the symbols are put underneath the door, he has no understanding of Chinese, but he knows to slide certain other symbols back under the door. The answers to those questions in Chinese. Now, the person outside the room would get the impression that the person in that room speaks fluent Chinese. However, he doesn't. He's just manipulating symbols with no understanding, no knowledge, no awareness of Chinese. That's the problem with symbol manipulation. That's all a computer really does at the moment. A chess-playing computer doesn't understand chess, doesn't have a clue about chess. All it knows is when certain symbols are slid under the door to slide out certain other symbols or patterns of symbols. The result is it wins a game of chess. But it doesn't know what chess is. It just knows to respond to the presence of certain symbols by sending out another sequence of symbols, a particular response sequence of symbols. So this is sort of the essence of a problem as to whether a computer could truly understand and be conscious the way that a human brain can be. But that's only a problem for modern computers using symbol manipulation. Other types of computers are being developed, so this may not be a problem for very much longer. Right, so now we've covered a lot of the philosophical sides of consciousness, although by no means all of them. It's time to actually zoom in a little bit. So let's now move our attention and focus it on attention. So what is attention? And how does it differ from consciousness? Is it an aspect of consciousness, Or is it consciousness? So, first of all, when we think of attention, we usually think of it in relation to vision. And many studies of attention do exactly that also. But remember that attention can apply to any kind of sensory stimulation. You can be attentive to sound, you can be attentive to a smell or to touch. So attention is not just visual. Attention is much more complicated than that. What's attention's goal? Well, its goal is not truthful perception of the world. Truthful perception of the world is neither required nor generally attempted by the brain. It's just not necessary to get a truthful description of the world around us. Conscious experiences focus on just gathering information as quickly as possible. Details are filled in to give a sense of continuity to our perceptions. So we feel that we're constantly attentive to the environment around us and that we have a full picture of what's going on around us. But really, we just have snapshots of pieces of sensory information, and our brain takes a best guess and fills in the spaces. For example, with your vision, your eyes dart constantly around the room, but you only actually focus on a tiny area of space. Your vision is really like a tunnel, and you take lots of snapshots, you move the tunnel around, you put a spotlight on different parts of your visual field, and then your brain joins them together, fills in the gaps, and you feel as if you're seeing the world around you all at once. When you're not, you're just jumping from snapshot to snapshot of a tiny piece of your visual field. So a point of attention in general is to really concentrate on what is important and to take a guess at the rest. Okay, so that's a goal of attention. When it comes to attention and timing, I'm going to discuss attention versus consciousness. I'm going to talk about directing attention, and I'm going to mention something called Libet's half-second delay, which relates quite strongly to consciousness itself. It shows that we might become consciously aware of something, even though we have not actually seen it yet. So consciousness is quite complicated. It's quite a complicated concept. Okay, so moving on. Right, so William James, let's talk a little bit about William James. He was basically kind of a father of, one of the co-fathers, let's say, of psychology, together with Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud has kind of gone out of favor quite a lot over recent decades for quite legitimate reasons. A lot of his ideas turned out to be false, but he still did create the field of psychology, at least in Europe. William James, however, created a sort of sister version of psychology over in the US. So William James asked a few questions. First of all, does consciousness cause awareness? Or does awareness cause consciousness? Do they affect each other at all? Here's a quote from him. It is a taking possession by the mind in clear and vivid form of one out of what seems several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought. That was his definition of consciousness. Focus, basically. Which leads us to free will. Again, James, another quote from him. My experience is what I agree to attend to. We firmly believe that we have the ability to control our consciousness through free will. Is it possible we simply think we have control over our experiences, however? We assume a choice was made because attention shifted, not because we made it. We could make a decision, act on the decision, all at a subconscious level, and then only when we've acted on that decision do we become consciously aware of making the decision. Therefore, no free will. The decision was made at a subconscious level, And when it was made, we became consciously aware of it, and also became consciously aware of making the decision as if it was a choice. Free will is a tricky one. The brain is a machine, and we have detected the beginnings of a choice, a decision within the brain before research participants are even consciously aware of making the decision. So, free will, it's a tricky one. We'll get back to free will. Filtering attention. So there's a number of listening experiments which have been performed that can cause your attention to switch between ears to follow a message without even noticing. So, for example, sounds can be put into the left ear, the right ear, alternately, and we switch our attention automatically without even noticing. Broadbent's theory. Subconscious filters parallel processing streams to produce focused serial outputs. So we have lots of parallel processing streams running within our brain all the time. There's a lot going on in the human brain. The subconscious filters those to produce a focused output. That's what we perceive as conscious, the filtered product. There's more subtle models which claim attention may simply allocate more resources, not a spotlight. So we always have a certain number of resources allocated to different streams, and consciousness is more about allocating more resources to certain streams, rather than focusing exclusively on one stream. Attention is very complicated. Paschler, for example, he postulated that it may not even exist, maybe an illusion. Not sure I buy that. Going back to the original cognito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. I'm pretty sure I'm conscious. I'm pretty sure it's not an illusion. The world around you may be an illusion, but the conscious experience simply cannot be, in my opinion, that is. People wiser than myself disagree. Okay, so effect and cause theories. James James had a few ideas relating to consciousness. One was that attention is decided by other brain cells or by some spiritual force. Which is it? Which is it? Is attention something that is automatic? Brain cells are triggered. They process activity in certain ways, and that's how we become attentive. Or is there some spiritual force guiding our brain? Two theories he came up with, the effect theory and the cause theory. Effect theory, brain cells guide brain cells. Cause theory, a force guides the brain cells. This hints very strongly at a soul. This is sort of similar to the differences between physicalism and dualism, between Descartes' idea of there being a body and a mind, separate entities that link together somehow, and physicalism, that the brain is a physical system and everything, including consciousness, is just a physical manifestation. He couldn't really defend either the effect theory or the cause theory very well, so he chose the cause theory and decided to go with that. That was really just due to personal bias on his part. There was no logical reason other than that. So, how sure are you? So, you hear the door open, and so you turn around to see who it was. Did you consciously perceive the door opening and then chose to turn, or did you turn for some other reason and assume it was because the door opened? What was the real reason? Attention is quite complicated. It can be that you are subconsciously aware of something and not consciously aware of it until it becomes important. So, for example, perhaps you're at a party, the room is full of people, everyone's talking. You're not really aware of any of the conversations going on around you, except the conversation you're having. Perhaps you're in a small group, you're talking to that group, You're not really aware of the conversations of the other groups until suddenly your name is mentioned by someone in one of the other groups. And immediately that name jumps out. You didn't hear any of the rest of the conversation, but you heard your name. And then you direct your attention to that group and you can hear everything they're saying. That shows you that a lot of, let's say, awareness is subconscious, completely subconscious. And it's only when there is something that your brain feels is relevant to your conscious mind that that event is passed on to the conscious mind. You become attentive to it. So a lot goes on without you being aware, without you being conscious, till your brain deems it necessary for you to be conscious of said event. At this point, I'm going to discuss Libet's experiments on the somatosensory cortex. This resulted in the observation of some interesting phenomenon. That is that we aren't aware in real time. What that means is you may become aware of a sensation, aware of something going on around you after that experience has occurred. You weren't aware of it when it occurred, but you have a memory of being aware of it whilst it occurred. What do I mean by this? I mean that you observe something unconsciously, and then a little story is created in your brain of being aware of it while it occurred, even though you weren't. This has been proven in Libet's experiments. So Libet, he electrically stimulated the somatosensory cortex of a number of patients during surgery. The somatosensory cortex is a part of the brain responsible for receiving information, sensory information from around the body. So, for example, if you touch something with your left hand, then a sensation is perceived. The way this works is sensory neurons in the hand, in the fingers, are stimulated. The signal is sent up to the somatosensory cortex, and the region of the somatosensory cortex that deals with, say, the left hand is stimulated. You can imagine a map of a human body on the somatosensory cortex. There's a region for the left hand, the right hand, the left big toe, the right big toe, the tongue, the lips. It maps onto the brain. Anyway, that's how it works. Now, if you stimulate the brain directly, so if you stimulate a certain region of the somatosensory cortex with an electrode, then you will feel a sensation as if part of your body was touched. And this is what Libet did in his experiments. He, at a certain intensity, he stimulated particular regions of the somatosensory cortex. Now, what's interesting is at that particular intensity, he needed to stimulate the somatosensory cortex for half a second, 500 milliseconds before the individual perceived the sensation. Less than 500 milliseconds was not enough, no conscious awareness. But once you got to 500 milliseconds, half a second, it was enough. Shorter stimulation could result in awareness if the intensity of a stimulation increased. Okay, so what happens to the lag? Reaction times of an individual to a stimulus can be 200 milliseconds. As I said, recognition takes something like half a second. So our body responds before we are consciously aware of why we are responding. Brain is stimulated, we react, and then we become aware of what we've done. This is interesting. It seems that we are backtracking our conscious awareness. This is known as subjective referral. After neuronal adequacy is reached, the event is referred back to the point at which it occurred. We come up with a story of being aware of something that occurred when we were not aware. So consciousness doesn't occur in real time. What were Libet's? Well, here they are. He concluded that consciousness requires neuronal adequacy to occur. Backward referral challenges materialism and the idea that consciousness equals certain brain activity. He believed that his data supported some kind of dualism. When a noise is heard, it is processed unconsciously, very quickly. We then become conscious of it only after turning our head in response to the sound. He also believed that we can still make some decisions consciously, but conscious awareness, that occurs separate from the experience. And that separation, he believed, implied a dualism. You can actually test Libet's delay yourself with the aid of a friend. This is how you do it. This is known as the cutaneous rabbit. You tap a pointed object, such as a pen or pencil, quickly and evenly, quicker the better, 5 times on another person's wrist, 3 times at the elbow, and twice on the upper arm. The taps should feel spread out along the entire arm instead of only occurring in 3 spots. This phenomenon should occur before all the taps have been completed. This means they are creating a conscious experience. They're creating that conscious experience not in real time. It's a story being generated by their mind. Dualism keeps cropping up again and again. Many philosophers go back to it, many scientists go back to it when trying to describe consciousness. This is known as the Cartesian theatre. Hume put it this way: the mind is a kind of theatre where several perceptions successfully make their appearance. What is on stage is in consciousness. It kind of feels to most people like you're sat in your head watching the world outside. And imagining is kind of like playing a fictional film rather than observing the real world. Just because something feels like a thing doesn't mean that's what's really going on. Where is consciousness? What is the location of consciousness? Many areas of the brain are correlated with certain kinds of processing. Stimuli enter the brain through the various senses. The brain processes that information and behavior results. Consciousness does not seem to appear in a specific place or at a specific time. To be conscious involves several regions of the brain being stimulated at different times. And then it's somehow all joined together to make us consciously aware. So you can't really pinpoint a physical location to consciousness in the brain or a temporal location, a time when that consciousness occurs, because we make up these stories after the event. We backtrack. The global workspace theory is a kind of extension of this idea of the Cartesian theatre. Bars in 1988 sort of continued with the theatre metaphor, using a bright spot on a stage as a kind of idea of attention. He stated that unconscious contextual systems process information sort of in the shadows, in the background, to affect the events that occur in the bright spot on the stage. Each part of the metaphorical theatre is a different aspect of consciousness, senses and ideas being actors in this metaphor. Memories, interpretations, and automisms are simply the audience. These metaphors are useful to a degree, but they don't really get to the core of what consciousness really is. If we take the theatre analogy out of consciousness, then we're kind of left, amongst other things, with Libet's theory and Francis Crick's theory that I discussed right at the beginning of this podcast. Libet's observations allowed him to come up with this one idea. He termed this neuronal adequacy, the theory of neuronal adequacy. He stated that most events do not reach the level necessary for conscious experience, less than that 500 milliseconds. So we are not conscious of them. And it's that line, that 500 milliseconds, that is a difference between being consciously aware of something and it being an unconscious experience. Crick, on the other hand, he termed this as his astonishing hypotheses. He determined that, or at least he theorized, that one's sense of self is merely the result of interactions between neurons and molecules. Stimuli are consciously perceived if the cells, the neurons, fire in synchronicity to create these kind of reverberations, these reverberatory circuits. If neurons throughout the brain in certain regions become synchronous with each other and fire at a certain frequency, then the individual becomes conscious of certain experiences. Neither Libet's theory nor Crick's astonishing hypotheses, however, answer the question that this podcast started with. What is the answer to the hard problem? All of these different theories, they all simply answer at one level or another the question of the easy problem. The easy problem. What happens in the brain when we're conscious? When do we become conscious? What part of the brain fires when we're conscious? How does it fire when we're conscious? How long does it take to become conscious? Are we conscious in real time? Or does consciousness occur after an event? These questions are important, but none of those questions tell us why it's like something to be something. The hard question remains unanswered. Well, I suppose it wouldn't be a hard question if it was easy to answer. We do not know why we feel, why we are aware, why we are conscious. The philosopher Daniel Dennett gets around answering the hard question by saying that it doesn't exist. There is no hard question, it's all easy questions. We're using the wrong language. Then it proposes that everything in the brain is under constant revision. Perceptions and ideas are always present as multiple drafts at various stages. He believes there's no point in asking which of these drafts are conscious, because this implies that the Cartesian theatre exists, the stage. We've kind of shown that it really doesn't. The sense of a narrative stream arises only when a question is presented and answered. Drafts can affect behavior in this way and leave traces in our memory, but there's no actual experience that occurs. According to Dennett, consciousness is an illusion. He's written all books on this, but it just doesn't seem to make sense to me. It doesn't seem to make sense. It's like something to be something. I feel, I am aware, I am conscious, I perceive colors, I perceive sounds, I perceive shapes. It doesn't feel like an illusion. I suppose an illusion wouldn't feel like an illusion, but an illusion would also not feel like anything. Not an illusion of consciousness. To me, consciousness does not seem like an illusion because I am aware, which is why I think Daniel Dennett is, I think he's tried to find an answer to the hard question, and he's failed. So instead, he's resorted to coming up with a kind of, I don't want to denigrate what he's come up with, because he is a very well-respected philosopher, and he has come up with some very interesting ideas over the years. But I just think that this particular idea that consciousness is an illusion just does not stack up, for the simple reason that we have qualia, qualitative experiences. Something that he says doesn't exist, but that all of our intuition and our internal cognition tells us does exist. So I think he's wrong about this. The multiple drafts theory is intriguing, but I disagree with it. Maybe you feel differently. So I've talked a little bit about what consciousness actually is. Well, in as much as we know anything about what consciousness actually is. But what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about how we can alter consciousness and what that actually means. So I'm going to talk about hypnosis very briefly. I'm going to dwell a little bit on meditation and how that affects consciousness. I'm going to talk about how drugs can affect consciousness. And then I'm going to finally, conclude this podcast by kind of doing a brief summary of what we know so far and hinting at what the future of consciousness might be. Okay, so first of all, let's discuss hypnosis. So what is hypnosis? It's a sort of induced state of altered consciousness. At least that's what some people think it is. It's a social interaction during which a person responds to suggestions and can be induced to have certain experiences, or the memory or perception can be changed in some way, and perhaps they can even lose the ability to perform voluntary actions. It's all done through suggestions made through the hypnotist. You know, the sort of thing, you're becoming sleepy, your eyelids are drooping, all of that sort of thing. If it all goes well, the subjects behave in ways that are consistent with whatever suggestions the hypnotist is making. Hypnosis works primarily with people that are highly suggestible. That's about 1 in 5 people. So about 1 in 5 people will respond to hypnosis. The other 4, not so much or not at all. There are a number of theories as to what actually goes on during hypnosis. Really, you can divide them into 2. The sociocognitive theory and the dissociation theory. The sociocognitive theory states that hypnotized subjects are just role-playing. They're just acting out whatever they think the hypnotist wants them to do. So they're just playing along. They're playing along very well. They may even convince themselves that they're under the control of the hypnotist, but they're really just acting. That's one theory. The other theory, the dissociation theory, states that hypnosis is a trance-like state. You actually do alter your consciousness. So conscious awareness becomes separated from other aspects of consciousness. You're in an altered state. Strongest evidence is for the dissociation theory. There's been a bunch of studies that show the analgesic effects of hypnosis, for example, known as hypnotic analgesia. People have basically been operated upon whilst under an hypnotic trance and do not appear to suffer any pain. So perhaps your consciousness is altered during hypnosis. How it's altered exactly, we're not totally sure about. Perhaps certain regions of the brain associated with self-control or with pain or with other aspects of consciousness just become suppressed during hypnosis. How exactly that occurs, we're not totally sure about, but hypnosis does seem to have a certain aspect of truth to it. More research needs to be conducted. Then there's meditation. There's a lot of research being conducted into meditation. Meditation produces a state of relaxation. There's different forms of meditation. Meditation generally, though, as a sort of general overview, it's a mental procedure that focuses the attention on a particular external object or an internal sensation, such as breathing. Effects of meditation. There's a lot of effects of meditation. One study, for example, found greater stress reduction and attention amongst participants who meditated compared to a group that underwent relaxation training. That was Tang et al. In 2007 that conducted that study. Another study showed that when participants were made to feel unhappy in an experimental procedure, those who'd received meditation training prior to being induced to feel sad were less unhappy than those who would not. That study was conducted by Farb et al. In 2010. But what's actually happening during meditation? What's actually happening? Well, let's talk a little bit about the most widely researched form of meditation, known as mindfulness meditation. In this type of meditation, a subject may focus, for example, on the breathing, to put all of their awareness directed all onto their breathing. They're aware of every part of the inhalation process and the exhalation process. They feel the breathing, they're aware of the breathing, and any other distracting thoughts, distracting internal thoughts or sounds from the environment around them are, well, not ignored, but they are acknowledged, and then the focus of attention is returned to the breathing. Practice of mindfulness meditation, which does take quite a bit of practice, can allow a person to reach a state of intense focus, where they feel that consciousness is in a very pure state, a very pure, very focused state, the sort of state that you don't tend to have when you are fully awake and engaged with the environment around you. So what's actually happening during this mindfulness meditation? Well, it's not just about relaxing. It's not just about breathing and therefore relaxing your body and mind, and that's why you get the benefits. It's a bit more complicated than that. Subjects' brains have been scanned whilst meditating, and controls have obviously been put into place. So people's brains have been scanned when they're not meditating or when they're just relaxing. And it seems that certain patterns of neuronal activity come into play during mindfulness meditation. So this is where I should sort of explain two different modes of thinking, known as the default mode network and the target positive network. The default mode network is a pattern of activity that you see in the brain when a person is, well, when they're worrying, when they're thinking about the past, when they're thinking about the future, when they're focused on events that are occurring around them. Their mind is wandering, basically. It's wandering. So when a person is procrastinating, when a person is worrying, when a person is basically, as people are most of the time, you're in the default mode network. It's the default mode network. It's called default because it's a default state. But there is another network that can be activated, known as the target positive network. The target positive network kicks in when an individual is intensely focused, almost lost in a task. So, for example, during mindfulness, when you're focused on the breathing with lots of practice, the breathing becomes everything. You become completely lost in the breath. You lose all other sense of self, all sense of your surroundings. You just become the breath. Now, we've all experienced a state similar to this in other aspects of our life. For example, when you're lost in music, when you're lost in a computer game, in a movie, engaged in some activity such as playing tennis. Basically, when you're totally in the zone, sometimes known as flow, when you're writing, when you're engaged totally in an activity, you can lose all sense of self. You are just the movie, you are just the book, you are just the task. That is known as the target positive network. When that is engaged, you are not procrastinating, you are not thinking about the past, thinking about the future, worrying about the present. You are just engaged in the activity. That's the target positive network. And mindfulness meditation has been found to engage the target positive network, which has real benefits. If you're depressed, if you're anxious, if you're worrying about anything, then by definition, it's your default mode network that's active. If your target positive network is active, your default mode network cannot be active. It's an either or. Either your target positive network is active or your default mode network. So training the target positive network allows you to better engage with things such as depression and anxiety. You can weaken those sensations. You can move on from them. So that basically is the target positive network, and that shows that it's an altered state. It's an altered state of consciousness, a state of pure activity, of pure engagement, rather than worry and procrastination. Okay, so meditation has some really positive effects. It just takes quite a while to actually develop the skills needed for meditation. Similar experiences to meditation can actually be induced through other activities, such as I said, music, playing a game, etc., to a lesser extent. But if we're talking about the intense experience that you get from meditation, this can also be engaged by exercise, or even by praying. Some people that are religious, they pray, and if they focus on the prayer enough, they enter that flow state. It's really just meditation. It's not the praying. It's not that you're in contact with God. You may believe so if you're religious. I do not believe so. I'm not religious. But the same experience that you can get from meditation, you can get through prayer. You can. Prayer is really a form of meditation when it's done properly. Exercise. If you exercise intensely, you've all heard of the runner who, when he gets totally in that zone, he's just running. He's breathing, he can feel his steps, and that's it. He's just in the moment. So exercise can also engage such states. Meditation, exercise, possibly prayer, other activities. Meditation is very good at it, though. Meditation really does get one into that state with practice. So, escaping the self. Escapist behaviors include drug and alcohol use, perhaps excessive television viewing, surfing the web, playing video games, etc., etc. Escapism is slightly different than meditation, because with meditation, you're trying to clear the clutter from your mind and just be in the moment doing the thing. That's really what meditation is trying to do. Whereas some of these other escapist behaviors, they have some similarities with meditation, but they're not focused, they're not clear, they can be more distorted. So aren't necessarily quite as good as meditation, especially drug taking, because obviously a person can become addicted to a drug, addicted to alcohol. There is facing the problems and there is running away from the problems. And taking drugs, taking alcohol is an effective way to get away from a problem, but the problem always comes back. With meditation, however, if you do it right, the problem can genuinely be dealt with. It can genuinely go away. Drugs of various kinds have been used for millennia to try and alter consciousness. So around 250 million people, it's estimated, use illicit drugs each year. That statistic was from the United Nations. That's back in 2009. The numbers are possibly similar now. Other widely used drugs include alcohol, prescription medications, caffeine and nicotine. They are drugs. They alter your perception. They really do. Even caffeine does. Drugs can help. They can give you energy when you need it. They can help you sleep when you need it, but they can become addictive. Many drugs are psychoactive, but and psychoactive drugs, they're not all bad. They're not all bad. I've taken psychoactive drugs in my time, and I've had some good experiences from them. It's given me a new perspective on consciousness, on my mind, on the world. But obviously, like everything else, there's moderation and there's excess. Trying something every now and then might be a good idea. It might help your mind, it might help your thought processes. But obviously, taking too much of a drug can lead to addiction and can actually lead to various psychiatric conditions. Let's go through a couple of drugs, basically sort of how they work and basically what parts of the brain they work on, what receptors, and what the effects are. So let's start with marijuana, cannabis. It's very widely used illicit drug throughout the world. It's hard to categorize it. It's not really a stimulant or a depressant or an hallucinogen specifically, but it can cause each of those sensations. So you can feel stimulated, you can feel depressed, you can hallucinate when taking marijuana. It depends on the strength, depends on the type. Generally speaking, it produces a relaxed, contented mood, together with more vivid perceptions. Experienced users appreciate the effects a bit more than novices. They learn to notice the effects a bit stronger. The same could be said for experienced meditators as well. The psychoactive ingredient is a compound known as THC. It operates at the cannabinoid receptors in the brain. Now, it can alter experience. It can alter memory. There's a lot of evidence showing that excessive use can actually cause problems with memory, long-term problems with memory and concentration, and also can increase the levels of psychosis that a person experiences. But it has medical uses too. For example, it can be used as a pain reliever, or even as an antiemetic, anti-nausea drug. So it has medical uses. Even recreationally, it's got quite a number of benefits. I mean, basically, we wouldn't have all the great music of the 1960s and 70s without marijuana, I would hazard to say. A lot of really excellent music, especially the more psychedelic music, was certainly written whilst the writers, the musicians were high on cannabis. Okay, so that's marijuana. Then we've got then let's talk about cocaine. Long history of use in the United States. Coca-Cola originally had cocaine in it, hence the name. Doesn't have cocaine in it anymore, but it did for quite some time. So Americans used to be very heavily addicted to cocaine. It's a stimulant. Users experience increased alertness, increased confidence, and sociability. Basically, it increases dopamine levels at the synapses, the connections between the neurons of the brain. And high levels of dopamine make you feel alert. They make you feel confident. They make you feel sociable. Habitual use of cocaine, however, in large quantities can lead to paranoia, psychotic behavior, and violence. So it can have some really quite negative consequences when it is abused. Amphetamines, next. A long history of amphetamine use for weight loss. Basically, it speeds up your metabolism, which can lead to weight loss. So a lot of people that are trying to lose quite sizable amounts of weight can resort to amphetamines. It also keeps you awake for longer. So people that need to be awake for long periods of time have in the past taken amphetamines to do so. It's not really got not many legitimate medical uses. But amphetamines have been used in the military in the past. A lot of people in the medical profession have used them just to cope with long shifts. Methamphetamine is the world's second most commonly used illicit drug. It's a form of amphetamine. It increases dopamine production and blocks its reuptake. This can damage brain structures responsible for cognition, memory, and emotion long term. Can cause considerable physical damage, so it can harm both the brain and the body. I'll now mention MDMA, also known as ecstasy. It's been popular since the 1990s, especially on the dance scene. It's an interesting drug, MDMA, because it has quite a strong yet not really mood-altering as such effect on the brain. The effects are strong, but it sort of more instills sensations than changes perception as such, depending on your perspective. Users can feel energized and in some cases hallucinate. It lowers dopamine, but also increases serotonin availability. It's serotonin that seems to have a key effect when it comes to MDMA. Can produce depression, memory loss, difficulty in completing tasks in excess, but MDMA has got certain positive effects also. MDMA tends to make people feel connected with people around them, with the rest of humanity, with the world. Increases empathy, makes a person feel less selfish, less individualistic, more caring. So it has some real positive effects. Some people spend years meditating to get pretty much the same effect that MDMA can induce. MDMA also has some medical benefits. Taking it has been shown to relieve the symptoms of Parkinson's disease, for example. So an interesting drug, MDMA, like the other drugs I've just talked about, in moderation it can have positive effects, but if abused, it can certainly have negative consequences. Then there's opiates, used historically to relieve severe pain. Opiates are depressants, include heroin, morphine, codeine. Users experience pain relief, relaxation, and in some cases euphoria. Very addictive. The opiates are very addictive drugs due to the effects of the opiate receptors, the pleasure receptors, and also the dopamine receptors, which increases the desire for the drug, helps the addiction process to build up. Long-term use of opiates can lead to attention and memory problems. It was a study by Gruber, Silvari, and Jurgelen in 2007, which showed that quite clearly. Addiction. Why do some people become addicted? Well, different people become addicted to drugs more or less easily, depending on the structures and the activity of certain regions of the brain. Addiction generally can be divided into the physiological and the psychological. Physiologically, activation of certain brain dopamine systems that play a role in generating pleasurable experiences can lead to addiction, specifically in a part of the brain known as the insula that governs cravings. Certain people basically have an insula that becomes active far more easily and makes that sort of person more readily able to become addicted to certain compounds and certain chemicals. So it's something you can inherit. You may have noticed that people that drink a lot, people that take drugs, these sorts of behaviors tend to run in families. Some of that might be social, but some of it may just be the genetics you're born with. There is psychological addiction as well. It's not just physiological addiction. The sensation-seeking personality trait, that sort of personality trait can lead a person to become addicted. They just seek out sensation. So you can become physically addicted, you can become mentally addicted to various compounds. To put addiction into context and compare sort of social environment with predisposition towards addiction, there's a couple of studies there's one specific study I'd like to talk about. So Robbins, Heltzer and Davis in 1975, they conducted a large-scale study of 898 US soldiers during the Vietnam War. These researchers found that there was widespread drug use amongst the US soldiers, over 90%. 1 in 5 returned from Vietnam to the US addicted to various drugs. Once home, however, approximately 95% of these drug addicts quit the drugs. Basically, removal from the stress of combat removed also the urge to take the drugs. So it shows you that social context has a real effect on the predisposition towards becoming addicted to substances and actually removing that addiction. This is why they say that people that are recovering alcoholics or drug addicts should keep as far away from alcoholics and drug addicts as possible. Get away from that environment. It makes recovery easier. You can't really have a discussion about consciousness, especially altered states of consciousness, without talking about sleep. Sleep is an altered state of consciousness and one that we all experience. If you live to be 75 years old, you will have slept about 25 years. So sleep affects us all, and it needs some sort of explanation. And we have some explanations for sleep. They're not totally convincing, they're not totally clear, there's still some gaps, but we've made quite a bit of progress. We know what happens during sleep. That area we've made a lot of progress in researching. It's just the why we sleep question that still has a few gaps. One theory is that we sleep because we are tired. Sounds obvious, but in other words, sleep as a restorative function, kind of like rebooting a computer. Your computer's on for too long, it starts getting slow. You get things like memory leakage and other phenomena that just slow down the machine, and a reboot usually fixes that. Sleep may have a similar role, although it's probably a bit more complicated than a mere reboot. When it comes to sleeping and waking up, I'm just going to go into some of the details here before we get back to the consciousness aspect. It's important that we maintain a regular sleep and wake time. We have something called a circadian rhythm, and circadian rhythms, they basically control when our body is most alert, when it's least alert, and sleep needs to follow certain patterns in order to get the full restorative effects of sleep. You've probably heard of this as the biological clock. Humans and many other animals have an internal biological clock, which basically operates and regulates your circadian rhythms. So these patterns, these rhythms, vary over about 24 hours and occur even in the absence of normal cues as to whether it's day or night. So regardless of whether there is sunlight helps to regulate our circadian rhythm, but experiments that have been conducted where people have been completely deprived of any cues as to time of day, sunlight, all the rest of it, they still tend to enter a certain rhythm of sleep and wake. It varies slightly. Some people have a shorter than average day rhythm, so less than 24 hours, and some slightly larger than 24 hours, slightly longer. Sleep is responsible for body functions, for restoring bodily functions, including the hormone levels, the blood pressure, body temperature, a number of other things. In fact, body temperature levels of hormones vary by quite a large degree over a 24-hour cycle. So the control of the circadian rhythm of our biological clock, it starts in a structure in the brain known as the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the SCN. This regulates another structure in the brain known as the pineal gland, which secretes a hormone known as melatonin. Increases in melatonin produce drowsiness. So if you've got high melatonin in your brain, you tend to feel sleepy. Low melatonin, and you tend to feel more awake. Interestingly, the levels of light that you're exposed to have an influence on melatonin levels. So when it's dark, you tend to produce more melatonin and therefore become more drowsy. When it's bright, the sunlight then inhibits, or the bright lights inhibit melatonin, you tend to feel more awake, which explains why some people get quite sad, quite low in the winter months. Low sunlight means high melatonin, means drowsiness, tiredness, lack of energy, all of those things. Okay, so can your clock, your biological clock, become misaligned, become inaccurate? Yes, it can. The most obvious way that can occur is with jet lag. If you travel to another part of the world where the time of day is different, substantially different, and you're suddenly experiencing sunlight when you normally would experience darkness, and vice versa, your circadian rhythm takes a bit of time to adjust. It takes a little bit of time, so it needs to sort of reset. Obviously, it can become out of whack for other reasons too. For example, night shift work. If you work nights, then you work days, and you work nights. If your shifts are changing regularly, then your biological clock needs to keep adjusting, and it never seems to get right. And this can have all sorts of health problems, problems with insulin levels, problems with blood pressure, hormones, all these things. Okay, so what about morning people versus evening people? Well, morning people awaken early and they're full of energy, and they tend to do most of their work and their best work early in the morning. The older you get, the more of a morning person you tend to become. Most over 65-year-olds are morning people. Night people or evening people, they tend to take longer to warm up in the morning. They tend to be drowsy at the beginning of the day. The best work that they perform tends to be later in the day. Most younger people tend to be evening people. So is sleep all the same? No, it isn't. The use of EEG to monitor brainwaves has shown that there are variations in brainwave activity which determine different stages of sleep. There's basically 5 stages of sleep. 4 of these stages are known as non-REM, and 1 is known as REM. During an 8-hour period, most people typically progress through all 5 full cycles, with each cycle lasting approximately 90 minutes. So we go through the cycle several times, and different stages of sleep are easier or harder to awaken from. So non-REM sleep, let's talk about that first. When awake, your brainwaves show a kind of high frequency, low amplitude pattern. In non-REM, non-rapid eye movement sleep, the body becomes increasingly relaxed. You have a slower pattern of EEG activity, and your heart rate and your respiration, your breathing, becomes slower. So that's basically what occurs during the non-REM sleep. A little bit more complicated than that, but that's a good overview. So non-REM stages of sleep. Non-REM brain waves of kind of a low amplitude and are fast with mixed frequencies. Brain activity changes, it alters with each stage. And people become more difficult to awaken as they progress through the 4 stages of non-REM sleep. So as you progress through those stages, the level of sleep becomes deeper and deeper, eventually becoming dreamless. You can dream in non-REM sleep, but not in every stage of non-REM sleep. Eventually you lose complete consciousness, because you might say that you are still conscious when you're dreaming because there is some awareness. But in the deepest stages of sleep, all consciousness is gone. You are completely unconscious. So when you're awake, as I've said, you tend to, while you're fully conscious, you have a kind of rapid frequency, low amplitude brainwave activity. In stage 1 of sleep, neural activity becomes unsynchronized, amplitude and frequency changes. Stage 2 of sleep, you basically have a slower brain activity. It begins to synchronize. Stage 3 of sleep, neural activity becomes more synchronized, and you have a pattern of waves that starts to emerge known as delta waves. They're kind of like an high amplitude and a kind of low frequency. Then you go on to stage 4 sleep, still delta waves, but you've got more of them. So you've got a very low frequency amount of activity when looking at the EEG, and high amplitude. And in REM sleep, neural activity is unsynchronized, but with low amplitude and a reasonably high frequency of activity. So sleepers take about 30 to 40 minutes to pass through these 4 stages of non-REM sleep. You fall asleep, non-REM stage 1, non-REM stage 2, non-REM stage 3, non-REM stage 4. And then you tend to go into REM sleep, which is when you dream. So REM, standing for rapid eye movement, noted because if you look at someone in REM sleep, their eyes are closed, but you can see their eyes moving, they're dreaming. So it's characterized by high frequency, low amplitude brainwave activity. Only occurs after people have gone through the 4 stages of non-REM sleep. So you go through non-REM before you go through REM. If you actually waken someone at the very beginning of the night, they often don't recall any dreams because they have been in a non-REM state. Later in the night, they will recall dreams usually, unless, of course, they're the sort of people that don't remember their dreams, as many people are. REM sleep is sort of difficult to distinguish from being awake on the basis of what's going on in the brain, the physiological activity. It's very close. It's very close to being awake. During REM sleep, breathing and heart rate can increase the same rate as if we were awake. So that physiologically, it can appear that we're awake, apart from the fact that the eyes are closed, of course, and the body is not moving very much. What's the purpose of REM sleep? Memory storage. REM helps consolidate memories. That's one theory. Brain areas that are active during the learning of the task become active again during sleep. You can monitor that in the brain. So, for example, part of your motor cortex that might be active when you're learning a new tennis move, for example, will become active once again when you dream that night. This shows that it may be involved, REM sleep, in consolidating those memories, in actually learning. Performance on tasks usually improves if you test someone a day after they've learned the task. So that night's sleep, the REM sleep in particular, will help to formalize those memories, to actually allow them to solidify in the brain. As long as people get 6 hours of sleep a night, that is, and the less sleep you get, the less your memories are able to be consolidated, the more difficult it is to actually learn tasks. Okay, so REM dreams tend to be quite long. As I said, you can dream in non-REM sleep, but in the early stages of non-REM sleep, but they're a bit shorter, those dreams. They're more about emotions and feelings than detailed events, whereas REM dreams tend to be vivid, involve detail, involve movement. But dreaming does occur in other stages of sleep. Paralysis of your muscles occurs also during REM sleep. This is thought to be so that we don't act out our dreams, because the parts of our brain, the motor cortex, which normally would control our body, they're active once again when we're asleep. And if the rest of our body was allowed to be active, then those signals from the motor cortex would go down to the body would respond and act out the dreams, which obviously would be quite dangerous. You've obviously heard of sleepwalkers, people who basically do act out their dreams, at least to a partial extent. What happens if we don't get enough sleep? Well, sleep deprivation studies have been conducted mainly on animals, but some studies have actually been performed on humans as well. The longer people go without sleep, the sleepier they get, obviously, and the worse their performance becomes at tasks. A fatigued, sleep-deprived person can experience tendency to make mistakes, poor concentration, diminished productivity, irritability, more vulnerability to accidents, clumsiness, and a depressed immune system, which can lead to more vulnerability to various infections. Research on total sleep deprivation isn't easily done with humans. However, some people suffer a condition where they gradually lose the ability to fall asleep, so they no longer can sleep. And individuals with this condition do die. The symptoms that they experience are very similar to the sort of symptoms you have in Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. Your memory starts to be affected, your personality starts to be affected, you can become extremely emotional, eventually you do die. So sleep deprivation is a very dangerous thing. In rats, totally deprived of sleep, they die quite quickly. They first lose the ability to regulate the body temperature, they lose weight, and yes, they do eventually die. Sleep, therefore, does perform biological functions, a number of biological functions. It does restore the brain, it does restore the body. It facilitates learning too. Without sleep, you cannot learn new tasks, at least you can't learn them well. So the theories of sleeping, the restorative theory just states simply that sleep allows the body to rest and repair itself. There's lots of evidence for that. Sleep increases following strenuous activity, for example. Growth hormones are secreted during sleep. They help to repair the body tissues. The brain's energy stores become replenished when you're asleep, and the immune system becomes stronger. This all backs up the idea that sleep is a restorative process. I mean, obviously it must have some function, otherwise we wouldn't have evolved to spend so much of our life asleep. Being asleep makes you vulnerable to predators. At least it did a couple of 100,000 years ago when we were hunter-gatherers and we lived out in the open. So the effects of sleep deprivation, you get the mood problems, a decrease in cognitive performance and attention, immune system gets weaker. All of these things can cause harm to the body, harm to the brain. So sleep is very necessary for normal function. No discussion about consciousness is complete without talking about sleep. Sleep is an altered state of consciousness, and it's one that we all experience. We don't tend to spend the entire night dreaming. Part of the night, part of the sleep cycle is dreamless, so consciousness at that point really is not present. However, when we're dreaming, we are conscious. We are conscious of ourselves. We are conscious of a world around us, even if it is a fantastical world. So let's address sleep. So sleep is an adaptive behavior. It serves a number of important biological roles. Restoration is key, both our body and our mind. We become tired during the day. We become physically exhausted and we become mentally exhausted, and sleep restores energy. It's thought to repair our body and to organize our thoughts and our mind, which I will discuss a little bit more as we go along. Okay, so restoration and sleep deprivation. The restorative theory of sleep states that sleep allows the body to rest and repair itself. There's evidence for this. Sleep increases following strenuous physical activity, for example. If you have a very physically active day, you tend to sleep longer and deeper the following night. Growth hormones are secreted during sleep. Growth hormones allow your body to repair itself, to grow, to fix any damage. So that's more evidence. The brain's energy stores increase, and the immune system is shown to improve its functionality. Sleep deprivation weakens your immune system. Your immune system is not as able to fight off infection. Good night's sleep, however, and your immune system begins to restore to its normal levels. So restoration is key. It's a key component of sleep. When you suffer any kind of sleep deprivation, mood problems occur. This shows that the brain is not working optimally. So irritability, that kind of thing. You also suffer the various detriments in your cognitive performance. So, for example, short attention span, memory lapses, that kind of thing. Mentioned the immune system, that becomes weaker from lack of sleep. And people tend to start suffering from, if the sleep deprivation is quite large, people start suffering incidents of micro sleeps. So small mini sleeps for just a few seconds. The eyes close and you are asleep very briefly. This is obviously the body attempting to induce sleep and to repair itself. And obviously this is quite dangerous, especially if you're driving or performing any kind of critical task. What controls your sleep? Well, it's the circadian rhythms. The circadian rhythm controls your sleep. So we have a biological clock. The biological clock is basically controlled, well, actually we have several biological clocks. Different organs and tissues in the body, it's been found recently, have their own biological clocks. So there is a biological clock for the liver, there is a biological clock for the gut, there is a biological clock for the brain. The main one, however, the big control center, is the one in the brain. It's located in a structure of the brain known as the suprachiasmatic nuclei. The suprachiasmatic nuclei is the body clock. It communicates with a gland nearby known as the pineal gland. And the pineal gland responds by producing a hormone known as melatonin. Melatonin induces sleep, makes you feel tired. Higher melatonin levels, the more sleepy you tend to be. Now, what's interesting about melatonin levels and the activity of the suprachiasmatic nuclei is it's cyclic, hence the circadian rhythm. It operates in humans over a 24-hour cycle, more or less. So melatonin levels rise and drop in a 24-hour cycle, therefore making us feel awake in the morning, tired at night. Not everyone's circadian rhythm or biological clock is the same, I should say. We're not all calibrated exactly the same. So, for example, even the same person can be calibrated differently at different points in their life. Young people tend to have a rhythm that is a little bit longer than older people. So as a result of that, they tend to be quite tired, sleepy in the morning. They tend to be awake till quite late, and this builds up day by day. So as a result, it's hard for younger people to wake up in the morning on average. It's hard for them to get to sleep at night because their cycle is a little bit more than 24 hours. Older people tend to have a cycle that's a little bit less than 24 hours. So as a result, older people tend to wake up quite early, and they tend to feel tired quite early as well. So age has an effect, but people are different anyway. Even people of the same age can have different biological clocks. Some people are morning people, some people are night people. I'm a night person. I don't like mornings. I do like the evenings. I have more energy as the day progresses. I tend to get a second wind in the evening and feel quite alert, even if I'm quite tired in the morning. Although I'm much better than I was. When I was very young, I was definitely not a morning person in any way at all. I'm not now, but then I really wasn't. I could sleep all day and I could be awake all night. But you know, biological clocks change with age. Okay, so I said this is all controlled by melatonin. Melatonin levels change with age. The amount of melatonin that you produce can go down as you get older, so you can find it harder to sleep. Older people tend to find it harder to sleep. And very old people over 70, for example, can sometimes have as little as 2 hours of sleep per night. And this explains a lot of the symptoms that you see, a lot of the ailments that you see in older people. Older people tend to have memory problems. Older people tend to have poor immune systems. And that's understandable. If you're not getting the sleep, you're not repairing your body as efficiently, you're not fighting off infection as efficiently, and your mind is not repairing itself. So actually, it seems quite a good idea, especially if you're older, to try to get more sleep. It's easier said than done. If your melatonin levels are low, then getting to sleep is tricky. You can take, obviously, various drugs to induce sleep, but a lot of these drugs, they have side effects, and they don't really produce good quality sleep. These sedating drugs, they kind of knock you out, but they don't really induce a normal sleep pattern. And as a result, the quality of sleep is low, and perhaps you don't get all the repair that you would with good quality sleep. So drugs are useful short-term to induce sleep, but not really long-term. The quality of sleep just isn't that great. So what can you do? Well, melatonin You can get melatonin supplements. They can help with sleep. Older people should really lower the amount of light they're exposed to at night and increase the amount of light they're exposed to in the morning. That's because light has a direct effect on melatonin levels. Light inhibits production of melatonin. So bright light inhibits melatonin, which means it makes you feel more awake. And low light tends to promote the release of melatonin, which therefore makes you sleepy. So if you want a good sleep-awake pattern, you need a lot of light at the beginning of the day and low light at the end of the day. That can really help. In terms of sleep itself, as I said, it facilitates repair of the body, but also the mind. It facilitates learning. So sleep strengthens neural connections needed for learning to occur. Research shows that memory in participants who slept was greater than those who didn't sleep. So a good night's sleep does improve memory. This has been shown. There's a good study by Drossopoulos, Schultz, Fisher, and Bourne in 2007 that showed that. REM and slow wave sleep, that's stages 3 and 4, are important for learning to take place. I should mention about these stages. Stages of sleep, there's basically 5 stages of sleep. So you're awake, and then when you fall asleep, you tend to first go into non-REM sleep. There are 4 stages of non-REM sleep. You get deeper as you go, stage 1, 2, 3, and 4 of non-REM sleep. And then you have stage 5 of sleep, which is REM sleep. This is where the rapid eye movement occurs. You can see someone's eyes moving, even though they're closed. This is when they tend to be dreaming quite actively. That's REM sleep, stage 5 of sleep. Sleepers take about 30 to 40 minutes to go through the 4 stages of non-REM sleep. Then they go into REM sleep. And the cycle then repeats throughout the night. At the beginning of the night, you tend to have more of the non-REM sleep. So the first part of the night is the deeper non-REM sleep. And as you progress through the night, you tend to have more REM sleep. So towards the morning, you have more REM sleep, so more dreams. It's thought that the non-REM and the REM have different purposes. The REM sleep is more about learning and memory consolidation and that kind of thing, at least it's thought to be. Whereas the non-REM sleep is a bit more about repairing the brain and actually doing a lot of that healing that you need when you're asleep. So sleep facilitates learning. So sleep strengthens neural connections needed for learning to occur. A number of research has shown that memory in participants who slept to greater extents than people who didn't improve their memory. So a good night's sleep improves your memory. The REM and slow wave sleep, so stages 3 and 4, are important for learning to take place. So participants who completed a complex task and later dreamed about it subsequently performed better on that task than non-dreaming participants. This was a study by Walmsley, Tucker, Payne, Benavides, and Stickold in 2010. So basically, you perform a task. So you're playing tennis, you're playing a computer game, you're performing some sort of physical task, and then you go to sleep and you dream. You go through the different stages of sleep, and during the REM sleep, you tend to sort of rehearse that task. You dream about what you did during the day. And what's happening in the brain is the neural connections that were firing when you were actually performing the task during the day, they are kind of consolidated. They're fine-tuned as they fire during the dreaming pattern. So basically, the learning of a task occurs. At the beginning of the learning task occurs, yes, when you're doing it during the day, but the learning is only really consolidated when you're asleep, when you have those dreams. You may have noticed this yourself. You might have, for example, played a computer game during the day. You keep losing at a particular stage. You keep failing at a particular level. You go to bed, you go to sleep, you get back on that computer game the next day, and you can do it. You can achieve that level And that's basically it down to the sleep itself. Those neuronal connections have formalized, and you have learned the task. It's also been shown that students spend more time in REM sleep during exam periods. So if you're studying, then you tend to need to firm up more connections in your brain, so you need more REM sleep. If you're physically active, however, then you tend to need more of a deeper sleep because it's your body that's being worn out. You need to repair it. So the non-REM sleep is basically fixing your body in a very roundabout sort of way, whereas the REM sleep is fixing your mind, consolidating your memories. So what about dreams themselves? I'm supposed to be giving you a podcast here on consciousness. I've given you an overview of what sleeping does, but the interesting bit here for this podcast is the consciousness aspect. So dreams, products of an altered state of consciousness in which images, fantasies, and reality all become mixed together. It's an altered state of consciousness. And it is a very altered state of consciousness because when you do dream, unrealistic events can occur, things that just couldn't occur in the real world, yet you seem to just take them for granted. Unless you have a lucid dream, a dream where you seem fully aware, all these fantasies are just taken at face value as if they're perfectly normal. You know, if a gorilla flew through the sky past your window when you're awake, that would be shocking. When you're asleep, it's perfectly fine. It's perfectly fine. Basically, your brain, or certain regions of your brain, change the activity when you're dreaming. So you don't really have that questioning aspect of your consciousness when you're asleep. You don't question reality to the same extent. In fact, there's one theory that says that's part of how dreaming allows you to cope with emotionally traumatic events. If something traumatic happens in the waking life and you go to sleep, you're probably going to dream about it. But in many cases, the emotions aren't quite so heightened in the dreamscape as they were when you were awake. So it's as if you can view the traumatic event, but with less emotional attachment. And as a result, you learn to cope. You learn to cope with it. It sort of loses its fear. Obviously, you can have nightmares. That's a whole different thing. But yes, part of dreaming seems to be about not just learning, not just your memory, not just repairing your body, but actually emotionally developing your senses so that you can cope with traumatic events which in the waking world were quite difficult for you. Okay, so REM dreams and non-REM dreams. You can actually dream in the non-REM stages of sleep. It's not just in REM sleep that you can dream. REM dreams are more likely to be bizarre and include lots of emotions, visual and auditory hallucinations, uncritical acceptance of fantastic events, all of those things. Whereas non-REM dreams, they're usually quite dull, usually quite basic. There will be, I don't know, just a couple of images. Maybe you'll be sat at a desk. Maybe you'll be just stood in front of a wardrobe deciding on which jacket to put on. So the non-REM dreams tend to be much duller, much simpler than the REM dreams. And actually, REM sleep is almost like consciousness. When you actually measure someone's body, someone's blood pressure, someone's heart rate, all these things, body temperature, when they're in normal REM sleep, it's very similar to how it is when you're awake, whereas in non-REM sleep, temperature is much lower, and heart rate, etc., have also reduced. So what's the explanation for the difference between the REM dreams and the non-REM dream? Well, non-REM seems to involve a general deactivation of quite a large number of brain regions. You're switching off a lot of your brain. Whereas in REM sleep, the brain structures associated with motivation, emotion, reward, vision, etc., become active. Note that the prefrontal cortex is not active. Prefrontal cortex is involved with decision making, with logic, executive control, that's not active during REM sleep. But the other structures are. So you're basically not being quite so judgmental when you're in REM sleep as you are when you're conscious. Non-REM sleep, most of the brain is shut down. What's happening when it's shut down other than repair? And how is repair working? Well, I mentioned that you're basically increasing the amount of growth hormone, and as a result, you're helping to heal your body. That's happening, but one other interesting thing is happening during this stage of sleep, the non-REM sleep. During non-REM sleep, your neurons sort of contract. The spaces between them increase. And this allows the cerebrospinal fluid, the fluid that bathes your brain, to kind of wash through those neurons. And as it does so, it can remove toxins from the brain. Toxins such as beta amyloid, a protein which can accumulate as you get older and can lead to Alzheimer's disease and dementia. So part of this non-REM or sleep is basically to kind of wash out the brain, to help it to heal. What do dreams mean? They might not mean anything. We're not totally sure. Freud had his ideas. He believed that dreams contained hidden content that represents unconscious conflicts. So manifest content, the plot of a dream, the way the dream is remembered, and latent content, what a dream symbolizes, the material that is disguised in a dream to protect the dreamers from confronting reality. There's no scientific evidence for this. It was a good theory, a good story, but there doesn't seem to be any evidence that these objects, these archetypes really represent anything in dreams. But, this was the beginning of psychology when Freud was around, so it was a good guess at the time. Then we have the activation synthesis theory. This states that the brain tries to make sense of random brain activity that occurs during sleep by sort of synthesizing it all together, bringing in a few stored memories, and coming up with some sort of narrative. Obson et al. In 2000 did a bit of research in that area. Emotion centers, these are parts of the brain known as the limbic system, become active, which explains the intense emotions that you can have during your dreams. The frontal cortex is not active, which is why you just seem to accept illogical events. You're not questioning anything when the frontal lobes are inactive. There are a few critics of this theory. Dreams are not that chaotic, well, at least not as chaotic as the activation synthesis theory states. In many cases, they're similar to everyday life, to waking experience, just with a few crazy bits thrown in. So this theory isn't such a good idea. It seems that what's more likely is that the dreaming is just about consolidating your memories, filing them away, getting rid of what you don't need, sort of strengthening memories which you do need, tidying everything up. It's almost as if during the day, your glass of memory fills up to the top. And then when you go to sleep, you empty that glass out. Some of it is emptied into different regions of the brain, where memories become permanent, experiences become formalized, and the rest is just thrown away, metaphorically speaking. So there's evidence for this. There's a bunch of evidence for this. People tend to learn things easier, earlier in the day than later in the day. So sort of hinting that the glass does have a finite capacity, and when it fills, it's filled. As the day progresses, you fill it up. When you go to sleep, you empty it again. One theory, also, the evolved threat rehearsal theory, sort of poses a question. The question is, why do people often dream about threatening events? And the answer, at least the answer that I've hinted at already, is that perhaps dreams help us to prepare to cope with real waking events. Dreams can simulate threatening events, and thus allowing people to sort of rehearse strategies for coping with them, mental strategies, emotions, that kind of thing. So dreams might have an adaptive value if rehearsal helps us to survive, reproduce, etc., etc. So that's quite a strong theory. There's a lot of evidence for that one. I kind of lean in that way myself. So whatever the purpose of dreaming, one thing is very clear. The type of consciousness that you experience whilst dreaming can be extremely profound, especially in the deeper stages of sleep, the non-REM sleep. For example, I mean, I've had this experience. I don't know if you've had this experience, but I've been lying asleep in bed, and I've started to sort of dream. And the dream has become quite intense. And then I've realized I'm actually kind of awake. My eyes are open. I'm looking around my bedroom. I can see my bedroom, but the dream is still kind of there. The dream has become sort of incorporated with reality. I sometimes feel slightly paralyzed. There are emotions going through my head. There's maybe shadows and images in the corners of the room. Sounds quite crazy, I know, but this experience is experienced by a lot of people at least once or twice in their life when you're in certain levels of non-REM sleep. And to be honest, this kind of altered consciousness, this sort of morphing of conscious reality with the dreamscape could explain a lot of reported religious events and UFO sightings, that kind of thing. People that say they've been visited by a demon or that they've been abducted by aliens quite often tell stories of lying in bed and then suddenly there is someone in the room with them and they can't move and all sorts of crazy things happen. To be honest, those people are probably just in non-REM sleep. They're half awake, half asleep. Your body tends to be paralyzed when you're in these states as well. By the way, the reason your body becomes paralyzed when you're asleep is to stop you acting out your dreams. The motor cortex of your brain controls your body. It fires when you move your limbs. And it also fires when you're dreaming. If you're dreaming that you're walking, the parts of your motor cortex that are involved in walking fire. But those signals are not allowed to get down to your limbs. That would be dangerous. They are blocked, but not always. This is why some people sleepwalk. This is why some people can act out dreams, even sleep talk. But if you kind of are in a strange sort of interim position between being consciously awake and dreaming, the sleep paralysis can be present because your body thinks it's asleep, but you can have enough consciousness to be aware of your room, so you can feel trapped. So quite a common experience, may explain alien abduction stories and stories about meeting demons and angels and all the rest of it. But really it's just an altered state of consciousness. Now I'd like to kind of move away from sleeping, move away from dreaming. We're coming towards the end of the podcast now, but I want to get a couple more points in before we conclude. First of all, I'd like to inform you that there's more than one of you in your head. There's more than one of you. Split brain studies have shown this. Your left hemisphere of your brain and your right hemisphere of the brain have more or less the same structures. So you have a left frontal lobe, a right frontal lobe, a left occipital lobe controlling vision, a right occipital lobe, temporal lobes controlling things such as hearing, parietal lobes, etc., etc. You have two brains. They act as one brain because there are a number of connections connecting the two, a bunch of nerves known as the corpus callosum, which send impulses between the two hemispheres of the brain, making them act as one. However, this isn't always the case. There's certain injuries and certain surgical procedures which can result in a separation of the two hemispheres of the brain. The corpus callosum becomes severed. And when that occurs, in some cases, the individual starts acting as two individuals, two separate individuals with separate intentions. They have separate aims. Now, I should say that the left hemisphere of the brain controls the right side of the body, and the right hemisphere of the brain controls the left side of the body. So in these situations where people become split brain, you can even end up in a position where the left hand will try and punch someone and the right hand will try and block them. It's very, very strange situation, very strange situation. You can actually project images to just the left field of vision or just the right field of vision, and you can ask the patient questions. Now, as it happens, it's usually just the left hemisphere of the brain that can talk, not the right hemisphere of the brain. So if you present images to the right field of vision, then the left side of the brain will see those images, and you can ask questions. What did you see? And the person can answer. They can say, I saw a picture of an elephant, or whatever it was. If you do this the other way around, if you show an image to the left visual field, which means the right side of the brain is aware of it, you can still ask questions, but usually the patient can't answer. So if, for example, you show a picture of an elephant, in the left field of vision, so the right hemisphere of the brain sees it, you might then ask the patient, what did you just see? The patient will say, I didn't see anything, because the person doing the talking is the left hemisphere, and the left hemisphere is only aware of the right field of vision, didn't see anything. However, you can then place a pen in the left hand, controlled by the right side of the brain, and you can say, could you draw what you saw? And then what will usually occur is the left hand will then draw an elephant. So the interesting thing here is we have two consciousnesses, two separate identities inhabiting the same head. The brain has two minds, which makes you think, what is a mind? Do you have two minds right now? Are they fighting for dominance? And the you you're aware of is just the dominant party? Or is it more subtle than that? Do you only have two minds when you separate the corpus callosum? And when the corpus callosum is present and active, these two minds act as one unified entity. Is consciousness just the sum of the parts? And if you split those parts, you can actually split the consciousness into separate individuals. For all we know, there's more than two. Maybe if you split the brain even more, you would get even more minds. We don't know. The final thing I'd like to say now, before I summarize, and it will be a very quick summary because I know this has been a long podcast, I'd like to mention a scientist, a neuroscientist by the name of Persinger, based in Wellington in Canada. He's done some very interesting experiments involving consciousness. His experiments have focused on a piece of equipment which has been dubbed the God helmet. Intrigued? I was when I first read about this. The God helmet is a gadget that you place over the head, and it interferes with electrical transmissions in a part of the temporal lobe of the brain. Interferes with those signals. And people have some very strange experiences when you place this God helmet on them and sit them in a darkened room. Many participants, they have what can only be described as an out-of-body experience. They don't feel part of their body anymore. They lose their sense of self. The sort of thing that it usually takes drugs to actually induce. They lose this kind of self-identity, and they feel part of a room, part of the universe, part of creation. They don't feel like an individual anymore in many cases. Their consciousness has been altered. So perhaps this sense of self, this sense of being centered in your body, is just a function of a few neurons in your temporal lobe firing in a particular way. And when those neurons are not able to fire in that particular way, you have an out-of-body experience, or you have a religious experience. You feel oneness with the universe. This could explain a lot of religious experiences. This could explain a lot of out-of-body experiences as well. So consciousness, sense of self, can be messed around with quite simply using a simple device. I do suggest that you check out Persinger. There's a lot of information on the internet about him, and read some of these studies. I've not really got the time to go into them in detail here, but it's very interesting, and they do kind of allow us to look at consciousness in a quite different way. I should say that some similar experiences can be induced with certain drugs, such as psilocybin, which you can find in certain mushrooms. It's an hallucinogen. And what it can do is it can trigger a similar sense, a kind of loss of self, a feeling of connectedness with the universe. All of those things can be induced with these drugs. Obviously, there are dangers of taking these drugs, so it's not advisable to take them, certainly not on a regular basis. However, these drugs can offer some quite profound experiences, can change the way people view the world, themselves, the universe. Psilocybin quite recently has been tried to treat depression. So people with severe depression, the sort of people that just can't get out of bed in the morning, they're so chronically depressed, debilitatingly depressed, have been given just one large dose of psilocybin under supervised conditions. They've experienced all these effects I've just described. Their consciousness changes, they feel part of the universe, they lose their sense of self. And in quite a large number of those cases, when people come down from the trip, the depression is gone, it's lifted, it's ameliorated, and it can stay ameliorated for quite some months afterwards, just from one dose. There's a few theories as to what's occurring when this happens, and one is that you're basically sort of switching off that default mode network that I discussed earlier, switching on the target positive network, and when you come out of the trip, your default mode network is basically reset. It's restored to factory defaults. There is quite a lot of evidence suggesting that people with severe depression and anxiety are kind of locked into their default mode network. So kind of giving them a break from that, using a drug like psilocybin can help to a large degree. I should put my disclaimer in here. I'm not advising anyone who's suffering from depression or anxiety or any other condition to take psilocybin or any other drug or hallucinogen. I'm just telling you what has been observed. Might be in a few years' time that psilocybin will be regularly prescribed to treat severe depression and anxiety. It should be an interesting field. And I'll tell you one thing, if nothing else, it's going to give a lot of patients an interesting outlook on both their own consciousness and everyone else's. Okay, so I think I should round up now. It's been a very long podcast, longer than I anticipated actually. Apologies for the rambling nature at times, but there's just so much to say about consciousness. Such a big field, and I've only just touched upon it really. So very brief summary. There is the easy problem of consciousness. How the brain allows consciousness to occur physically, which bits of the brain fire to allow us to perceive colors, feel emotions, etc., etc. Then there's the hard problem of consciousness. Why is it like something to be something? Easy problem. We've made a lot of progress with a lot of progress. Hard problem, not so much. We probably need a paradigm shift in the research direction, really, to just get our heads around why we feel, why we are, why we have qualia, qualitative experiences. But just because we don't understand that right now doesn't mean we're not going to understand it. No need to start accrediting gods and goddesses and all of these sort of supernatural entities with giving us consciousness. That's a God of the gaps argument. I'm sure we'll work it out eventually. Progress is being made. Okay, well, with that said, thank you very much for listening. I hope to speak to you again very soon with my next podcast. I'm still deciding on a topic for that. If you would like to know a little bit more, then I suggest you do a little search for David Chalmers, a philosopher who does quite a lot of research into consciousness. Also do a bit of research into Persinger. Again, some very interesting work with him. There's a number of other interesting researchers out there, but I'm sure you'll come across them in due course. Now, with that said, I will finish up, and just to finally say that if you would like to follow me on Twitter, my Twitter handle is @MarkOfTheD. That's @MarkOfTHE I'm quite controversial on Twitter, but I'm sure you'll be fine with that. If you'd like to help support the podcast, you can visit my website, scienceontheedge.com, and click on the donate tab. Any little donation would help keep me interested, help keep me motivated, and help keep me producing podcasts. So that's all for now. Have a great day, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Thank you.